In October of 1906, a cavalry detachment from Fort Wingate in New Mexico Territory was sent into the Mesa country southwest of Gallup on what the post commander's log described as a routine inspection of a reported disturbance near a Zuni settlement. The detachment consisted of 8 men under the command of a sergeant named Harold Voss. 5 of those men did not return. The Army's official record of the incident, which I found in the National Archives Record Group 393, the records of the United States Army Continental Commands, describes the outcome as follows. 5 enlisted men became separated from the main party in difficult terrain and were not recovered despite a 3-day search. The file closes there. No court of inquiry. No extended search operation. No correspondence between Fort Wingate and Washington about what those men had been doing in the terrain from which they did not return. The file closes, and something else opens in its place. A gap so precisely shaped that after a while you stop believing it is accidental. I came to this through the Zuni side rather than the Army side, which is the only reason I found it at all. I was reading through the published field correspondence of Frank Hamilton Cushing, the ethnographer who had lived with the Zuni people in the early 1880s, and whose relationship with them was, by the standards of his era, unusually close and mutually regarded. Cushing had died in 1900, but his correspondence with colleagues at the Bureau of American Ethnology had been donated to the Smithsonian's National Anthropological Archives, and a portion of that correspondence, the portion I was reading, dealt with what Cushing described as the Zuni's structured knowledge of the Mesa formations south and west of their pueblo. In a letter dated 1888, Cushing wrote to his bureau colleague Washington Matthews that the Zuni held specific and detailed prohibitions about certain chambers in the lower Mesa formations, not the cliff dwellings, not the high ancestral sites that were already becoming subjects of archaeological interest, but a category of space he described as the rooms below the rooms, which the Zuni understood as belonging to a different order of existence than the surface world. He had not entered them. He had been asked not to. And he had, he wrote, seen enough in his years with the Zuni to take that request seriously. By the time this reaches you, you will understand what the Zuni elders had been warning about those lower chambers for generations, before 5 Army soldiers walked into them in October of 1906, and why the warning, specific, geographic, rooted in a tradition of knowledge the Zuni had maintained across centuries, was ignored by the people with the most immediate reason to heed it. Consider the geology first. The mesa formations of the Zuni Plateau in western New Mexico are composed primarily of sandstone and shale deposited during the Permian and Triassic periods, with later intrusions of volcanic basalt that create, in certain places, a layered landscape of extraordinary complexity. The ancestral Pueblo peoples, the people the Zuni regard as their own ancestors, built into these formations across roughly 2,000 years, and the upper cliff dwellings and mesa-top structures they left behind have been studied, measured, and cataloged since the first Anglo-survey expeditions arrived in the 1850s. What has been studied far less systematically are the natural cave and chamber systems that run through the lower sections of certain mesas, the spaces beneath and behind the constructed architecture, where the natural rock creates rooms and passages that were known to the people who built above them, and that were, in a number of documented cases, sealed, not collapsed, not abandoned and gradually filled, deliberately sealed, with stone and adobe, in a manner that required sustained effort and suggests sustained intention. And the distinction matters enormously. A space that is collapsed is a space that is ended. A space that is sealed is a space that someone decided should be kept. Those are entirely different relationships to what is inside. The people who sealed those openings understood what they were sealing in, and they intended that it stay. The Zuni, who regard themselves as the living descendants of the people who built and used those formations, did not inherit only the physical structures. They inherited the knowledge of why the ceilings were done, and the responsibility that came with that knowledge. That responsibility had a name, a lineage, and a practice. A specific set of obligations that devolved through particular family lines to particular individuals in each generation. Obligations that did not expire and did not diminish just because the territorial government of New Mexico had decided that the land those chambers sat in now belonged to the federal domain. The Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of American Ethnology received a report in 1893 from a survey party working in the Zuni Plateau region that documented 14 such sealed openings in the lower faces of 3 adjacent mesas. The survey party was composed of geologists, not archaeologists, and their notation of the sealed openings was almost parenthetical. They were looking at the rock formations, not at what had been done to them. But they noted the seals. They noted that the seals appeared old. And they noted that when they approached one of the sealed openings to examine it more closely, 3 Zuni men who had been accompanying the party as guides positioned themselves between the survey team and the sealed rock face and, without raised voices or visible hostility, made it unmistakably clear that the approach was unwelcome. The survey party withdrew. Their report mentions this exchange in 2 sentences and then moves on. But those 2 sentences were what put me onto the larger record, because a survey team composed of professional government scientists does not withdraw from an area of interest without reason. And the reason they gave, that the Zuni guide's reaction suggested the site carried cultural significance that warranted caution, is not the language geologists used in 1893 when they simply wanted to move on. That is the language of men who had actually felt something in that moment, and were trying to describe it within the conventions of official report writing. This is the part I keep returning to. The warning the Zuni delivered to survey teams, to traders, to missionaries, to army patrols across the last decades of the 19th century was not a vague spiritual prohibition. It was specific. Cushing had been told, and he wrote this down in his 1888 letter in plain language, that the lower chambers of the mesas in question were not to be entered, because what was inside them was not inert. He struggled with that word, as he acknowledged in the letter, because his training as an ethnographer pushed him toward interpretive frameworks that translated indigenous knowledge into categories legible to institutional audiences: religious belief, ceremonial prohibition, ancestral custom. But the elder who had spoken to him about the chambers had been specific in a way that resisted those translations. The elder had not said the chambers were sacred in a general sense. He had said they were occupied, not by the living, and not precisely by the dead. The Zuni made a distinction, Cushing wrote, between places that were inhabited by the spirits of known ancestors and places that were inhabited by something older that had never been human. The lower mesa chambers were the second kind. I want to be careful here, because I am not in the business of telling you what to believe about the nature of what the Zuni understood those chambers to contain. What I am in the business of is telling you what the documentary record shows, which is this: that the Zuni had a consistent, structured, multi-generational warning about those specific places, that the warning was communicated to every outside party who came into proximity with the sites across a period of at least 25 years before 1906, and that in October of 1906, a party of United States Army soldiers entered one of those sites over the explicit objection of Zuni men who were present and who communicated the prohibition by every means available to them, short of physical obstruction, and 5 of those soldiers did not come back out. The Army record I found in Record Group 393 is thin by design. Sergeant Voss's after-action report, filed on October 19, 1906, describes a detachment dispatched in response to a report of unauthorized occupation of federal land near a Zuni settlement. The report of unauthorized occupation was itself the product of a complaint filed by a cattle ranching interest that had been attempting to establish grazing rights in the Mesa country and had encountered Zuni resistance to their presence near certain sites. This was not unusual in 1906 New Mexico territory. The displacement and enclosure of indigenous land through the mechanism of federal grazing permits was an ongoing process, and the Army was regularly deployed to enforce or investigate competing claims. What was unusual in Voss's report was the notation that 3 Zuni men had approached the detachment before they reached the Mesa and had, through a combination of Zuni and the limited Spanish that served as a common language in that region, communicated that the area the soldiers were heading toward was not safe to enter. Voss noted the warning. He noted it in the way a careful non-commissioned officer notes things that may later need to be explained, as a fact, without editorial judgment. He continued the patrol, and that is where the file goes thin. The next entry in the sequence is dated 3 days later, October 22nd, and it records the conclusion of a search operation for 5 missing enlisted men. The search had covered the Mesa approaches and the immediate surrounding terrain. The search had not entered the lower Mesa chambers. The entry notes, without explanation, that the chambers were not accessed during the search. It does not say who made that decision or why. It does not say whether the Zuni were consulted, whether they offered or refused assistance, whether the 3 men who had warned Voss before the patrol were present during the search. The file closes on October 23rd with a summary notation: 5 enlisted men missing, presumed dead, incident attributed to terrain. Attributed to terrain. In a region the Army had been patrolling for 30 years without losing men to terrain. There is a letter I found in a separate collection, the personal papers of a Fort Wingate chaplain named Reverend Arthur Coyle, donated to the New Mexico State Records Center and Archives in Santa Fe by his family in 1962. That fills in what the official file does not contain. Coyle was not present during the search, but he was the man the survivors came to afterward, which is what chaplains are for, and what they told him he recorded in a letter to his brother in Pennsylvania written on October 28, 1906, 5 days after the file closed. Coyle was a careful writer, a former seminary instructor with a precise sense of language, and his letter is notable for what he chooses to describe and what he explicitly declines to describe. He writes that the 3 men who returned with Sergeant Voss were not injured. He writes that they were not disoriented in the way that men lost in difficult terrain are typically disoriented. No dehydration, no exposure, no signs of physical hardship. He writes that what they described to him, in confidence, as having occurred at the Mesa, he would not commit to paper in detail, because he was not certain his own interpretive framework was adequate to the task, and because he felt that some accounts are better left to the people who experienced them. But he writes one specific thing. He writes that Voss told him the soldiers who did not return had entered a passage in the lower Mesa face, and that the passage had, within a very short time of their entry, become inaccessible from the outside. Not blocked. Not collapsed. He used a different word, which Coyle renders in the letter with visible discomfort. It became, Voss said, as if it had never been there. I have not been able to explain that away. I have read enough geology of the Zuni Plateau sandstone formations to understand that passages in that kind of rock can shift, that erosion and internal pressure can produce changes in chamber access that are rapid and that can appear, to a frightened observer in failing light, more dramatic than they are. I have held that explanation up against Coyle's letter and Voss's words for a long time, and I keep coming back to the same point. Voss was a professional soldier with 20 years of service who had operated in rough terrain across 2 continents, and the word he chose in a private conversation with a chaplain was not blocked and not collapsed. He said it became as if it had never been there. The widening of this record is, if anything, more troubling than the central incident. In 1903, 3 years before the Voss Patrol, a trading post operator named James Wetherill, related to the Wetherill family whose members had documented the Mesa Verde cliff dwellings in the 1880s and 1890s, wrote in his business journal, which was later deposited in the special collections of the University of New Mexico, that he had been told by a Zuni elder that 2 prospectors had entered the lower Mesa country in the previous spring and had not been seen since. Wetherill's entry is matter of fact. Disappearances in remote terrain were not uncommon in that period. But he notes that the Zuni elder who told him seemed unsurprised, and that the elder used a phrase Wetherill translated loosely as they went where the warnings are given for. Not where they were warned against going. Where the warnings are given for, as if the warnings and the place existed in a relationship of mutual necessity, as if the warnings had been generated by the place itself, across time, precisely because of what kept happening there. In 1898, a geological note filed with the New Mexico Territorial Survey references anomalous magnetic compass behavior in a section of the Zuni Plateau Mesa country that the note's author locates, by the coordinates given, within a mile of the sealed chamber sites documented in the 1893 Bureau of American Ethnology report. The anomaly was logged, flagged for follow-up, and never followed up on. The territorial surveyor who filed it was reassigned to a different district the following year. In 1911, 5 years after the Voss Patrol, a field agent for the Bureau of Indian Affairs named George Collier submitted a routine administrative report on the Zuni reservation that contained, in its penultimate paragraph, an unremarkable sentence, noting that Zuni men continued to maintain a watch presence near certain sites in the lower Mesa formations southwest of the Pueblo, and that this watch had been in place, according to the Zuni he had spoken with, continuously and without interruption for as long as any living person could remember. Collier flagged nothing. He filed the report. It sits in Record Group 75 of the National Archives, uncited, between 2 reports about cattle disputes. But that sentence means something when you read it next to the 1893 survey, next to Cushing's 1888 letter, next to the closed file of October 1906. A continuous watch, without interruption, for as long as any living person could remember. The Zuni were not guarding those chambers against outsiders only. They were watching them. Maintaining a presence. In the way you maintain a presence near something that requires ongoing attention, not a relic, not a ruin, but something that is still. In whatever sense the tradition understood it, active. What we lost when those 5 men did not come back, Private Eugene Hartwell, Private Darrell Sims, Private John Ocampo, Private William Brandt, Corporal Elias Moore, whose names appear in the Fort Wingate muster rolls, and whose families received the standard notification of loss and difficult terrain, and nothing else, was not just 5 lives, though 5 lives is not a small thing. What we lost was the last moment at which the institutional machinery of the United States government came into direct contact with those chambers, and could have stopped, could have asked, could have sat down with the Zuni men who had walked out to meet Voss's patrol specifically to deliver a warning and said, "Tell us what you know. Tell us what the watch is for. Tell us what is in those sealed openings that your people have been maintaining a continuous presence beside for as long as anyone can remember." They did not ask. The file closed. And the Zuni went back to watching. The chambers are still sealed. The Zuni have not changed their position on whether they should be opened. The knowledge of what is inside them, the specific, generational, carefully maintained knowledge that generated the warning Cushing received in the 1880s, that the 1893 survey guides communicated without words, that the men who met Voss's patrol tried to deliver in the only language available to them, is still held in the way it has always been held, close, intact, and offered freely to anyone who will receive it as a warning. If you know someone who has looked at a sealed opening in a cliff face and wondered who put it there and why, share this with them. The 5 names are in the file. The warning was given. No one in a position of authority chose to listen to it, and that choice has a weight that does not diminish with distance.